Alden sat alone in his small, dimly lit apartment. The soft hum of the refrigerator echoed through the stillness, a steady reminder of the oppressive quiet. Outside, the rain fell steadily, tapping against the windows, restless whispers in the night. Shadows stretched long and ominous across the walls, reaching toward corners where the dim light could barely hold them back. The room was quiet, too quiet. Yet, despite the calm surroundings, an overwhelming sense of dread hung in the air. Alden's pulse quickened with every tick of the clock, his mind racing, tangled in thoughts he couldn't seem to control. His fingers gripped the edge of the tattered curtain. The fabric, damp with sweat, clung to his hand. It had started a few weeks ago. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., Darius Blackwood left his house. No sound, no hesitation, just that same slow, deliberate walk into the dark streets. Alden had seen it so many times now, he had lost count. He watched from behind the curtain, breath shallow, heart pounding, unsure if he even wanted to know what lay beyond those shadowy steps. At first, it had been simple curiosity. Perhaps just a strange habit or some sort of nightly ritual, something harmless, surely. But the nights dragged on, and Alden found himself unable to shake the unease. There was something too precise in the way Darius moved. It was too calm, too deliberate. The streets were empty, the world unaware, and that made it worse. No one else seemed to notice, as if Darius existed in a realm beyond their reach, beyond their understanding. Alden's fingers trembled. The shadows in the room stretched further, their dark shapes twisting, creeping toward him. He tried to dismiss it. A neighbor with peculiar habits, eccentric maybe, but harmless. Still, the knot in his chest tightened, his thoughts circled, and the sense of dread refused to fade. Something was not right, no matter how much he tried to tell himself otherwise. The rain continued to fall outside, creating a rhythmic drumming against the windows. It only made the silence inside feel heavier, more suffocating. Alden felt a chill creep down his spine, the kind that sank deep and refused to let go. He was utterly alone in his fears. He could feel it in every corner of the dim apartment. Who could he talk to? Who would even believe him? The last time he tried to confide in Leora, his closest friend, she had dismissed him with a wave of her hand and a casual tone. "It's just a late-night routine," she'd said, as if that explained anything. But Alden couldn't shake the feeling. He knew there was more to it than that. At exactly 3 a.m., the routine began again. Darius Blackwood opened his front door without a sound, the motion so smooth and deliberate that it felt like a scene from a dream. He stepped outside, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the street lamps, an unmoving shadow before slipping into motion, gliding down the rain-slicked street. Alden's breath hitched, his chest tightened as if the air itself had grown too thick to breathe. He didn't want to wait anymore. No more endless nights of watching and wondering. Tonight, he would follow. Tonight, he would know. The streets were damp, the cobbled sidewalks glistening under the dim light. Shadows stretched and shifted with every flicker of the street lamps, their shapes distorted and endless in the wet haze. The air pressed heavy against Alden's skin, as though the world itself was trying to hold him back. He followed, each step slow and deliberate, his mind racing faster than his feet. The fear was there, persistent, gnawing, alive, but it no longer felt like a choice. What was Darius doing? Where could he possibly be going? The questions churned in Alden's mind, each one louder than the last. He watched from the edge of the window, his breath fogging the glass as Darius moved further into the distance. The dark swallowed him in fragments. First his silhouette, then the faint glimmer of his figure as he turned a corner. Alden felt his pulse hammer in his ears. His heart seemed to beat louder than the rain. What if Darius saw him? What if he knew? The thought rooted Alden to the spot, his legs trembling beneath him. But he couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. He had spent too many nights in fear, too many hours consumed by questions that only led to more silence. Tonight, he would step into the darkness, follow Darius, and uncover the truth, whatever it was, whatever it might cost. The clock in Alden's mind seemed to slow, each second dragging on endlessly. Time had become a cruel trick, stretching and twisting as shadows shifted around him. They formed strange, eerie shapes, dancing across the damp walls of narrow alleyways. The city didn't feel like it usually did. It felt alive, breathing with an unnatural rhythm that pulsed through the darkness. Every step Darius took was deliberate, precise, But Alden couldn't shake the sensation that something unseen guided him, something watching him from the shadows. What lay at the end of this path? Alden couldn't guess, couldn't let his mind settle long enough to imagine it. Each time he blinked, his fear grew sharper, doubling, pressing into him like a weight he couldn't carry. Every step forward felt like a step into something darker, something suffocating, as though the air itself conspired to hold him back. Was he walking into someone else's nightmare? Or was this his own? Would he ever find his way back from this twisted path? Or was the way forward all that was left? The rain fell harder now, each drop striking the ground with a ferocity that seemed deliberate. It masked his footsteps as he followed deeper into the city's forgotten corners, but it also drowned him in its relentless noise. The silence was louder than the rain, somehow. It pressed into his ears, his mind, and the only thing breaking it was the faint, rhythmic sound of Darius's movements ahead. Alden's breath came shallow. He could barely see it anymore, the air around him merging into a blur of shadows and fear. The streets looked unfamiliar now, alien. He had no idea where he was, and a wave of nausea crept through him, tightening his throat. His instincts screamed at him to turn back. Every fiber of his being urged him to run, to go back to the safety of his dim apartment, to pretend he had never started this. But he couldn't. Not now. He had come too far. Tonight, he would follow Darius Blackwood to the end of the path, wherever it might lead, no matter how terrifying. The truth was waiting, dark and unavoidable, and it had to be revealed. The clock struck 3:15 a.m. Alden felt it more than he heard it, a tremor in his chest that whispered there was no turning back. His apartment had been suffocating, he remembered, a trap he couldn't escape from, even if he'd tried. The silence inside had been worse than anything outside, wrapping around him like a smothering weight. The rain outside had been steady then, a rhythmic drumming against the windows, and every sound had seemed unnaturally loud, sharp, deliberate. The soft ticking of the wall clock had grated at his nerves, each tick hammering into his thoughts, counting down to this moment. He had sat on the edge of his worn-out couch, his foot tapping against the floor, his mind racing with doubt. The small table in front of him had been cluttered with what he thought he might need. A flashlight, a black hoodie, an old pair of sneakers worn enough that they wouldn't make much noise on the wet pavement. It had been a simple plan, but now, standing in the rain, the reality of it seemed far more complex. And yet, he had no choice but to keep going. His fingers trembled as he zipped up his backpack. The faint scrape of the zipper echoed through the room, sharp and jarring, like a warning he couldn't ignore. Everything he touched felt heavier than it should have, an unnatural weight, as if the objects themselves were aware of the significance of his decision. The dim light above him flickered once, twice, then gave out completely. The room plunged into shadows so sudden that Alden froze, his breath trapped in his chest. The darkness seemed alive, pressing against him, wrapping itself around him, until the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, as though some unseen presence might be watching him, waiting. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the oppressive silence, forcing himself to push past the creeping paranoia. It was just a bulb, just a coincidence, he told himself, but the uneasy weight in his chest refused to lift. Something about tonight felt different. The air carried a heaviness, a danger he couldn't define. His eyes darted to the clock. 2:35 a.m. Time was slipping away too quickly, yet the fear rooting him to the spot made each second feel unbearably long. With shaky legs, he stood, the motion feeling like a struggle against gravity itself. He pulled on the black hoodie. The fabric clung to him uncomfortably, like a second skin he couldn't escape. As he moved, each action seemed deliberate, almost wrong. The small flashlight slid into his pocket, its weight unfamiliar. The phone disappeared into the backpack after he set it to silent, a precaution that somehow made his heart race faster. The rain streaked down the window in uneven trails, blurring the outside world into something dark and unrecognizable. The street was empty, but not quiet. It felt alive in ways that set his nerves on edge. His breathing quickened as he approached the front door. Each step carried him further from safety, the air around him growing colder, sharper. His hand gripped the doorknob tightly, his knuckles pale against the dark metal. He leaned his head against the door, the cool surface grounding him for a moment as his mind raced with doubts. What if Darius already knew he was being watched? What if tonight wasn't about Alden finding answers, but something else entirely? Something darker? The thought twisted his stomach, made his pulse thunder in his ears. He felt the weight of his own fear pressing down on him, threatening to keep him rooted in place. Leaning heavier against the door, he struggled to steady himself. He was in too deep. He could feel it now, every inch of his body screaming at him to turn back. But the truth loomed larger than his fear, and he knew he couldn't stop. Not tonight. The clock struck 2:45 a.m. 10 minutes remained until Darius would emerge. Alden stood frozen, his thoughts swirling, but he knew he couldn't back out now. He had to see this through, whatever it meant, whatever the risk. Walking back to the window, he pushed the curtain aside just enough to see the faint outline of Darius's house across the street. The lights were off, the windows dark. Yet, there was a tension in the air, a heaviness that settled over everything, something he couldn't explain but felt in every nerve. The ticking of the clock grew louder in his mind. It seemed to sync with the rapid, uneven beat of his heart. Alden closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to steady himself, but the images came anyway. Darius walking into the fog, disappearing into the night, fading like a shadow he could never grasp. Each scene played on repeat in his mind, taunting him. Tonight, though, would be different. Tonight, he would follow, stay hidden, and finally uncover the truth about where Darius went and why. A faint creak sounded somewhere in the building. Alden spun around, his breath catching, his chest tightening as the sound echoed faintly in the quiet. The hallway outside his apartment was still, but distant footsteps drifted toward him, barely audible over the constant rhythm of the rain. His paranoia flared, gripping him, making him doubt everything. Was someone out there? Could Darius already know about his plan? The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, this was fear talking, nothing more. The clock now read 2:55 a.m. Alden grabbed his bag, tightening the straps until they dug into his shoulders, and opened the door as quietly as he could. The hallway was empty, silent, but heavy, as though the air itself carried a warning. He hesitated, ears straining for any sign of movement, before finally stepping out into the night. The rain greeted him with a cool sting, droplets sliding down his face like icy fingers. The street outside was deserted, its quiet punctuated only by the steady drumming of rain and the occasional, distant rumble of thunder. He moved quickly, ducking behind a parked car, his eyes locked on Darius's house. The lights inside remained off, but a faint movement near the front door caught his attention. A shadow shifted, subtle, deliberate. Alden crouched lower, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then the door opened, and Darius stepped out. Even in the dim light, Alden recognized him instantly, the tall, lean figure moving with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. Each step was silent, deliberate, as if the wet pavement itself yielded to his presence. Alden held his breath, his muscles tense, his mind screaming at him to stay hidden. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Now he just had to follow. Alden stayed low. His body was taut with tension as he watched Darius turn the corner and begin walking steadily down the dimly lit street. The fear in his chest felt almost unbearable, threatening to root him to the spot, but he forced himself to move. He stayed back, far enough to remain unseen, close enough to keep track of the dark figure ahead. The night seemed alive with shifting shadows. Every corner felt like it concealed a pair of watching eyes. Yet Alden pressed on, each step pulling him deeper into the unknown. The darkness wrapped around him like a shroud as he stepped cautiously onto the damp pavement. The air was icy, chilling his face and hands as his breath emerged in shallow puffs that disappeared into the cold. Ahead of him, Darius moved steadily, his tall figure cutting through the mist, clinging to the ground in wispy tendrils. Alden placed his feet carefully, but every step felt impossibly loud. The quiet crunch of wet gravel beneath his sneakers echoed in his ears, sharp and unnerving, and he winced each time the sound broke the fragile silence. Darius moved with an unsettling rhythm, each stride measured, deliberate, as though he were following a path only he could see. His head tilted slightly forward, as if listening to some inaudible guide. He didn't glance back, but Alden couldn't shake the feeling that Darius knew he was there, that every movement Alden made was somehow being tracked. His skin prickled, his pulse raced. He found himself glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, scanning the shadows for any hint of movement. The flickering streetlights overhead cast strange, distorted shapes across the pavement. Shapes that twisted and lurched in his peripheral vision, but seemed still when he turned to look directly at them. The neighborhood was unnervingly quiet, as though the entire world had fallen asleep and left only Alden and Darius awake. Houses loomed on either side of the street, their windows dark and opaque, their silhouettes heavy with silence. Occasionally, Alden caught a hint of motion, an almost imperceptible shift in a curtain, the flicker of a shadow against the glass. But each time he paused to look, there was nothing. The emptiness pressed in on him, broken only by the faint hum of the distant city, muffled and heavy beneath the weight of the fog. Every step Alden took felt like a step further into something he couldn't understand. Something that waited in the darkness, just beyond his reach. He kept a careful distance, staying far enough behind to avoid being noticed, yet close enough to track Darius's every move. The man's black coat seemed to dissolve into the night, and there were moments when Alden feared he'd lost him entirely, only for Darius to reappear under the faint glow of a streetlight, his figure sharp, almost menacing against the murky backdrop. Alden's nerves frayed with every passing second, his senses heightened to the point of exhaustion. Every sound, a rustling leaf, a dripping gutter, seemed amplified, each one making his heart skip, his breath catch in his throat. At one point, Darius stopped abruptly. His silhouette froze in the middle of the street, still and ominous. Alden's breath stalled in his chest as he ducked behind a parked car, his knees threatening to give way beneath him. He crouched there, motionless, his fingers clutching the cold metal edge of the car door for balance. The seconds stretched painfully, each one heavier than the last. Alden's mind spiraled with frantic thoughts. Was this it? Had Darius spotted him? Was he about to turn around, his eyes locking onto Alden's? Then, without warning, Darius moved again, his pace unhurried, his movements as calm as before, as though the momentary pause had been nothing at all. Alden exhaled slowly, shakily, relief coursing through him for a fleeting moment. But the fear didn't ebb. It lingered, pressing harder against his chest. He couldn't shake the suspicion that the pause had been intentional. A subtle warning, a quiet acknowledgement. Or was his paranoia distorting everything? The tension gnawed at him, relentless. His palms were damp with sweat, his legs trembling under the strain of staying hidden, staying quiet. The streets grew narrower as Darius walked on. The houses became sparser, their dark windows staring blankly at the empty road. The occasional streetlight barely illuminated the fog now. Its weak glow flickered, unable to push back the oppressive darkness. With each step, Alden's unease deepened, the sense of isolation closing in on him like a trap. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the shadows themselves were watching him, waiting for him to falter. Ahead, the rusted gates of an abandoned playground loomed into view, their metal bars streaked with rain and age. The wind whispered through the space, coaxing soft, eerie creaks from the swing sets that swayed slightly in the cold air. Darius walked past without a glance, his figure melting further into the shadows. Alden hesitated, his instincts screamed at him to turn back, to abandon this reckless pursuit, but the pull of curiosity and the weight of fear held him fast. He forced his trembling body forward, his eyes fixed on Darius's retreating form, each step an act of defiance against the dread that gnawed at him. A sudden sound, a metallic clink, pierced the stillness, sharp and unexpected. Alden froze, his breath hitched, his head whipping around to search for its source. Nothing. The street mocked him with its emptiness, the silence deepening his unease. He hurried forward, his movements more frantic now, his breath shallow and uneven. Darius veered abruptly into an alleyway, his figure dissolving into the shadows like a phantom. Alden's stomach churned, his pulse thundered in his ears as he slowed, his caution growing with every step. The alley was narrow, its walls closing in like a vice, the dim light above casting only the faintest glow. Shadows pooled in the corners, dark and impenetrable, and the air carried the faint stench of mildew and decay that made his nose crinkle in distaste. Reaching the edge, he pressed his back against the cold brick wall, the rough surface biting into his skin through the fabric of his hoodie. He leaned slightly, peeking around the corner with painstaking slowness, his heart pounding against his ribs. Darius stood further down the alley, his back to Alden, his tall frame unnervingly still. He appeared to be focused on something ahead, something hidden from Alden's view. The dim light barely touched him, the darkness around him shifting subtly, almost as though it were alive, moving with a sentient intent. Alden's throat tightened, his mouth dry as sandpaper. Fear weighed heavily on him, yet he couldn't bring himself to retreat. His feet felt anchored to the ground, his body frozen between the primal urge to flee and the desperate need to understand. He watched Darius intently, noting the slight tilt of his head, the way he seemed to be listening. To what, Alden couldn't guess. The movement was so small, yet so wrong, that a shiver ran through him, his skin crawling with unease. And then it happened. Without warning, Darius turned his head sharply, his face half obscured by the shadows, his gaze cutting straight to the spot where Alden crouched, hidden in the gloom. The massive, looming silhouette of the warehouse rose out of the darkness. It stood like the skeletal remains of some forgotten giant. Broken windows glinted faintly under the dim light of a street lamp far behind Alden, jagged edges catching just enough light to resemble sharp, watchful eyes. The air thickened as he approached, heavy with dampness, the sharp tang of rust mingling with the sour undertone of decay. His stomach churned. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to abandon this pursuit into the unknown. But he couldn't. Not now. Curiosity had dragged him this far, its grip unrelenting, refusing to loosen. Ahead of him, Darius moved with a calm certainty, his silhouette sharp and unyielding against the faint mist. Reaching the rusted doors of the warehouse, he pulled them open with a strength that seemed unnatural. The metallic groan tore through the still night, echoing loud enough to make Alden flinch. Darius slipped inside, seamlessly merging with the shadows, as though he belonged to them. The doors swung shut behind him. The sound was final, a resounding punctuation that left Alden staring at the sealed entrance, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. He didn't want to follow. Every logical part of him demanded he turn around and leave this place behind. Yet the memory of Darius's deliberate movements, the unnatural calm of his steps, hung in Alden's mind, dragging him forward. Step by agonizing step, he moved closer, the tension mounting with each inch. The closer he got to the warehouse, the colder the air grew. The weak glow of the street lamp finally faded as he stepped into the deep shadow cast by the towering structure. It was as though the night itself had consumed him, cutting him off from anything familiar or safe. Alden stopped at the doors, his hand hovering inches from the rusted metal handle. The chill radiating from its surface seemed to seep into his skin, numbing his fingers before they even touched it. His chest tightened, his breath hitching in his throat, the weight of the moment pressed down on him, suffocating. What waited inside those doors? Did he truly want to know? He didn't have an answer, but the thought of leaving without one filled him with a dread that rivaled the fear of moving forward. Finally, he grasped the handle. The icy metal bit into his palm, making him wince. The door creaked open just enough for him to slip inside. The sound echoed briefly before the oppressive darkness swallowed it whole. The interior consumed him instantly, the shadows pressing against his eyes, his lungs, leaving him motionless as the stale, metallic air filled his senses. Somewhere in the distance, the faint drip of water punctuated the silence, each droplet sharp against the stillness. As his eyes adjusted, vague shapes began to emerge from the gloom, hulking, unfamiliar forms that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The space stretched out endlessly, cavernous and cold. The ceiling was so high it vanished into shadow. Rusted machinery stood like skeletal sentinels, jagged edges glinting faintly, where weak beams of moonlight slipped through shattered windows. Chains dangled from the rafters, swaying slightly, their links clinking faintly, though there was no breeze. Alden took a cautious step forward. The crunch of dirt and debris underfoot felt deafening in the stifling quiet. His hand gripped the small flashlight in his pocket, but he didn't dare turn it on. The thought of illuminating the space, of exposing more than his mind could handle, was unbearable. He strained his ears for any sound, but the silence pressed back against him. Alive, watchful, and impossibly heavy. Ahead, through a gap in the rusted machinery, a faint glow flickered. It cast erratic, elongated shadows that crawled across the walls, their movements unnatural, almost deliberate. His stomach churned as dread gnawed at him, but his legs moved anyway, dragging him closer to the light. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted him, pulling him back with every inch forward. When he finally reached the glow, the sight before him sent a cold wave of nausea through his body. The walls were scrawled with symbols, haphazard and jagged, their lines wet and glistening as though they had just been painted. The patterns twisted and overlapped in a chaotic frenzy. The longer he stared, the harder it became to focus, his eyes stinging as if the very sight of them defied comprehension. On the ground, a larger symbol dominated the space, a violent, chaotic spiral etched deeply into the floor. Its edges were dry and crusted, but the center shimmered faintly under the flickering light, the dark stains radiating outward in jagged lines. Alden's breath hitched. Every instinct told him to leave, to run. But his feet remained rooted, the weight of what he saw holding him in place. Near the faint, flickering light, Alden's eyes fell on a crude altar, cobbled together from warped wood and rusted metal. The surface was a chaotic mess, cluttered with objects that made his stomach twist, a set of bloodied tools, their edges jagged and cruel, small trinkets, unrecognizable in their purpose, that seemed to hum faintly with an inexplicable wrongness. The light itself came from a cluster of candles surrounding the altar, their flames flickering wildly despite the stagnant air, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed alive. But Darius was nowhere in sight. Alden's breath hitched, his chest tightening as he scanned the cavernous space. He turned sharply, heart pounding against his ribs, but the emptiness around him only deepened. The realization hit him hard. He was alone, or so he thought. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out every rational thought as his trembling hand instinctively reached for the door behind him. Then he heard it. Faint at first, but unmistakable, a soft rustling, the sound of fabric dragging across the ground. He froze, his body tense, his mind racing. Slowly, he turned toward the noise, his wide eyes scouring the shadows for any sign of movement. The dim candlelight only deepened the darkness beyond its reach, the shifting shadows playing cruel tricks on his vision. The rustling grew louder, closer, each sound scraping against his nerves. He wanted to yell, to call out for Darius, but his throat closed up, the fear too thick to let the words escape. And then he saw it. A figure emerging from the edges of the light, moving through the shadows with an unsettling, almost mechanical rhythm. It was Darius. Alden's breath caught in his throat, but something about the way Darius moved sent a wave of cold dread washing over him. His steps were erratic, jerky. Each movement felt wrong, as though he were being yanked forward by unseen strings. Darius stopped abruptly, his body snapping to an unnatural stillness. His head tilted to one side, the angle sharp and unsettling, as he slowly turned to face Alden. The flickering candlelight illuminated his face, throwing it into sharp, grotesque relief. Alden's stomach churned at the sight. Darius's eyes were wide and unnervingly unblinking, his pupils so dilated they seemed to swallow the irises entirely. His mouth hung slightly open, trembling as though he were struggling to form words that refused to come. A low, guttural sound rose from his throat, a noise so raw, so unnatural, that it sliced through Alden's chest like a blade. Alden stumbled back, his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. His mind screamed at him to run, just move, but his body remained locked in place, as if frozen by the air itself. Darius took a step forward. The jerky, unnatural motion sent waves of dread coursing through Alden's veins. The sound that accompanied him grew louder, more warped and distorted, seeming to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Clutching at his chest, his breath shallow and erratic, Alden finally turned, forcing his legs to obey, and bolted toward the door. He barely reached it before a deafening clang echoed through the space, the door slamming shut with enough force to rattle the walls. Spinning around, Alden pressed his back against the cold, unyielding metal, his gaze darting into the oppressive dark. Darius was gone. The candles flared violently, their unsteady flames casting shadows that writhed and stretched, grotesque and predatory, as though alive and hungry. A deep shift stirred in the blackness, something vast, something that dwarfed Darius entirely. Alden couldn't see it, but he felt it. An ancient, malevolent force that seemed to fill the room with its presence. The suffocating weight of its attention settled squarely on him, pressing against his chest like an iron band. The warehouse itself seemed to breathe, its walls closing in with each labored inhale. Alden's flashlight trembled in his unsteady grip, the weak, flickering beam cutting uneven paths through the gloom. Shadows sprang to life with each twitch of his wrist, distorting the space until nothing felt real. His foot struck something hard, and he stumbled, nearly falling. Looking down, his stomach clenched. Scattered bones lay across the floor, some splintered and cracked, others arranged in intricate patterns that defied explanation. The sight of them, their silent meaning, made him instinctively recoil. The air grew colder as he ventured further in. Each step felt like wading into a living, suffocating force. The candles barely held back the darkness now, their dim light flickering weakly against the shadows pressing in from all sides. In the center of the space, a crude table emerged from the gloom, its surface stained and slick with darkened smears that seemed fresh. Tools lay scattered across it. Knives with serrated edges, rusted clamps, and objects so alien in form they made his stomach churn. They gleamed faintly under the feeble light, their surfaces coated in thick reddish-brown streaks that reeked of metal and rot. His eyes were drawn to a cluster of books and papers stacked haphazardly on a nearby crate. Their disarray was unsettling, almost deliberate. He approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, each beat thunderous and erratic. The papers, yellowed and brittle, were covered in erratic scrawls and twisting symbols. They spiraled across the pages in ways that felt unnatural. The language was unfamiliar. The jagged, sharp letters seemed wrong somehow, as though they weren't meant to be read. Just looking at them felt like trespassing, as if his eyes weren't supposed to linger. One journal caught his attention. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, its spine barely holding together, but the edges of the pages gleamed faintly, recently disturbed, as though someone had handled it moments before. His hands trembled as he reached for it. The weight of the book was heavier than he expected. Opening it, he found the first few pages filled with precise drawings, circles entwined with runes, their lines pulsing on the paper in a way that made him feel faintly sick. His stomach churned as he turned the pages. The images grew darker, more grotesque. Twisted figures with hollow, staring eyes seemed to follow his every move. Then the writing began. The words were in English, though the handwriting was jagged, barely legible. One line, scrawled across the page, sent a chill down his spine. "The veil between worlds is thin here." Further down, another note read, "They are watching, always watching. We are but vessels, hollow and waiting." Alden's hands shook. The journal felt colder the longer he held it. He turned the pages faster, desperate to understand but dreading what he might find. The descriptions grew more erratic, rituals, offerings, invocations, all detailed with obsessive precision. One entry stopped him cold. "Tonight, the binding is complete. The vessel will open the gate, and through it, they will come." The words hung in his mind, their weight crushing. He slammed the journal shut, the sound reverberating through the silent room. It felt deafening. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, his vision blurred slightly, the edges of the room seeming to close in. A thought clawed its way into his mind, relentless and cold. Darius is the vessel, or something else is. The realization struck like ice water, making his legs feel weak, his balance uncertain. A faint sound broke the oppressive silence, a soft, deliberate scraping, somewhere deeper in the warehouse. The noise dragged against his nerves like nails on glass. He backed away from the crate, his movements slow and unsteady. The flashlight quivered in his hand, the beam darting across the room. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally. Their shapes defied the angles of the machinery and crates. Each step Alden took sounded deafening in the stillness, the echo amplifying his fear. Then he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, drawing closer with every measured beat. They came from the same direction Darius had vanished into earlier. The sound sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through Alden. His pulse raced as he turned toward the noise, his flashlight trembling in his unsteady grip. The footsteps paused briefly. The silence that followed was almost worse. Then they resumed, quicker this time, the deliberate pace replaced with urgency, as though whoever or whatever was following him had caught his scent. His thoughts spiraled into chaos, a tangle of fear and regret. He needed to leave. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but the paths around him seemed to twist endlessly into the dark, offering no clear escape. He stumbled forward blindly, his feet crunching over debris and fragments that cracked like brittle bones beneath his weight. The sound was loud, far too loud, and each step seemed to give him away. Behind him, the footsteps quickened. They grew heavier, closer, each one echoing like a hammer striking metal. He rounded a corner and froze, his breath catching painfully in his throat. In the faint, flickering light ahead, something moved. A figure, unnaturally tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bent at strange, grotesque angles that defied logic. It stopped abruptly, tilting its head with an eerie precision, as though listening. Without warning, it stepped into the shadows, vanishing completely from sight. Alden's knees weakened, his body sagged against the cold wall for support. He clamped a hand over his mouth, fighting the urge to scream. His flashlight flickered weakly. The brief darkness that followed was suffocating. In that moment, he swore he heard it, breathing. Slow, shallow breaths, unnervingly close, as if someone or something was just inches from him. The footsteps resumed, echoing now from all directions, disorienting him further. They bounced off the walls, chaotic and unrelenting, a cruel symphony of fear. Alden gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to move despite the suffocating weight of terror pinning him down. He stumbled into a smaller room off to the side, his movements frantic, his eyes darting in every direction. The shelves lining the walls caught his attention. They were cluttered with jars. The glass was murky and clouded, the contents inside distorted but unmistakable. Organs, preserved in thick, yellowish liquid, floated grotesquely, suspended like trophies in their silent, glass prisons. Alden's foot caught on something, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot up his arm as he landed hard, his flashlight slipping from his grasp. It rolled away, its beam settling on a pile of clothing nearby. His breath hitched as he crawled toward it, the light illuminating the torn, stained fabric. His stomach turned as recognition washed over him. The patterns, the shirts, jackets, scarves, they were familiar. They belonged to his neighbors, to people he knew, people who had vanished without a trace. Alden scrambled to his feet, grabbing the flashlight, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He turned toward the main room, his pulse pounding in his ears as if it might burst. The footsteps behind him were deafening now, steady, relentless, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. He knew he was out of time. As he reached the door, a sound rippled through the air, low and guttural, rising from the shadows. It wasn't just noise. It was a voice, distorted and unnatural, whispering his name in a way that sent shivers racing down his spine. His breath hitched as he turned, the flashlight flickering weakly in his hand. The beam trembled across the room, revealing a figure that made his stomach twist. Darius stood there, or what used to be Darius. His body was contorted, his spine arched unnaturally, his face stretched into a grotesque semblance of a smile that didn't belong on any human face. His eyes burned with an unnatural glow, faint but unrelenting, and his hands twitched at his sides, jerking, spasming as though something was pulling the strings. The voice came again, low, rasping, and clearer now. "You shouldn't have come," it said, the words heavy with something that made Alden's knees weaken. Alden's breath caught, his scream strangled in his throat as Darius, or the thing wearing his body, took a slow, deliberate step forward. The air around him seemed to ripple, warping with each movement, as though reality itself was being bent out of shape. The candles scattered across the room flared, their flames shifting into a sickly red hue that bathed everything in a dim, hellish glow. Shadows clawed at the walls, their movements too fast, too deliberate, as though alive. Panic surged, and Alden bolted, his legs moving on pure instinct. His flashlight swung wildly, the beam casting jagged, fleeting shapes as he sprinted for the exit. Behind him, the footsteps erupted into a frenzied rhythm, pounding against the ground with a speed and weight that didn't belong to anything human. His name echoed through the warehouse, each repetition louder, more distorted, twisting into something that barely resembled language. He reached the door, his trembling hands fumbling for the handle, the cold metal slick beneath his grip. The pounding footsteps were closer now, the sound of pursuit mingling with the warped, echoing chant of his name. The door groaned under his weight, the rusted hinges fighting against him. Just as it gave way, he felt it, a cold hand brushing the back of his neck. The touch was fleeting, but the voice that followed wasn't. It whispered, low and menacing, the words slicing through the thick air. "You'll never leave." The atmosphere around him shifted violently, the warehouse itself seeming to come alive. The air thickened, pressing down on his chest like a living thing, each breath a struggle against the weight of it. The walls pulsed faintly, the concrete rippling like skin stretched too tightly over something vast and writhing beneath. The red glow from the candles flickered erratically, throwing monstrous, shifting shadows that moved with a terrifying purpose. Alden's legs quaked. His body refused to respond, as though the terror anchoring him had reached down into his bones. From the center of the room, Darius stood tall, his face twisted into a smile that wasn't human, his eyes empty pits of glowing red. His voice, low and guttural, reverberated through the space, weaving words in a language that felt like it tore at Alden's sanity. Each syllable seemed to dig deeper, gnawing at his mind, as if the sounds themselves were alive, probing the darkest corners and planting seeds of dread. Around Darius, a circle of symbols burned into the floor, glowing brighter with each passing second, the light flickering with an unnatural intensity. Then they came. At first, Alden thought the shadows were merely illusions, tricks of the light flickering against his fear. But they moved against the glow, slipping free from the walls and taking shape, forms that defied logic. Twisted, elongated limbs reached out, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes, or what should have been eyes, were hollow voids, darker than the deepest pits of the night. They hovered at the edges of the room, whispering in a voice Alden couldn't understand, though he knew instinctively that they spoke of him. He could feel it in his very bones. Darius raised his arms, his fingers clawing at the air as his voice grew louder, reverberating through the room. The glow in the circle pulsed, and the shadows surged forward, gathering around him like disciples before a god. Alden stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony that vibrated through his skull, their voices mocking, accusing, promising pain. One of the creatures stepped closer, its body folding and unfolding in ways that made Alden's stomach churn. Its head tilted, the empty voids of its eyes locking onto him. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed, the words slithering into his ears like ice. It moved closer, and Alden's legs finally obeyed, stumbling backward as the thing reached out a spindly hand. He tried to turn and run, but the space had shifted. The door he'd come through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of pulsating darkness. The air grew colder, each breath clawing at his throat. He spun back around, only to find Darius standing inches away, his face mere centimeters from Alden's own. His eyes locked onto him, burning with an intensity that felt like it could strip away his very skin. "You don't understand," Darius whispered, his voice layered with something ancient and primal. "You're part of this now." Alden's heart pounded as Darius stepped back, his arms outstretched while the circle beneath him flared to life. The symbols burned brighter, their light searing into Alden's retinas. The ground trembled, and a deep rumble resonated from beneath, like the growl of some massive unseen beast. The walls seemed to collapse inward, the warehouse shrinking, tightening, until it felt like there was no space left to breathe. From the center of the circle, something began to rise. At first, it was a shapeless void, blacker than anything Alden had ever seen. It expanded, writhing and twisting as though struggling to take form. Then the shape solidified, and Alden's mind recoiled. It wasn't just a monster. It was wrong. Its presence defied logic, its shape shifting and breaking apart as if reality itself couldn't hold it. Eyes opened across its surface, too many to count, each one staring directly at Alden. Its mouth, if it could be called that, yawned open, revealing rows of jagged, shifting teeth that seemed to grind against each other in anticipation. Alden stumbled back, his back hitting the wall as the thing loomed over him. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a deafening roar that filled every inch of the space. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature's many eyes blinked in unison, and in that moment, Alden knew he wasn't just looking at something. It was looking into him. Every memory, every thought, every fear was laid bare, its gaze stripping him down to nothing. Darius's voice boomed over the roar, his words incomprehensible but filled with purpose. The creature shifted, its focus snapping to him as if awaiting a command. For a brief moment, Alden thought he might be spared, that whatever this was would turn on its master. But then Darius pointed at him, his smile widening to an impossible degree. "He is the final piece," Darius said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "The door opens through him." The creature surged forward, and Alden screamed. Its form enveloped him, cold and suffocating, filling every inch of his being. He felt himself unraveling, his mind fracturing under the weight of its presence. Memories slipped away, replaced by darkness. His body no longer felt like his own, his senses dulled to everything except the overwhelming void. And then, silence. When Alden opened his eyes, he was no longer in the warehouse. He stood in an endless expanse of black, the ground beneath him non-existent. The air was heavy with whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakable. He turned, hoping for some sense of direction, but there was nothing, only the void. And then he heard it, Darius's voice, faint but clear. "You're one of us now. Welcome." The whispers grew louder, closing in, and Alden realized the truth. He wasn't alone. They were all around him, watching, waiting, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His scream was swallowed by the darkness, and then there was nothing. Only silence.